Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. We're at the Phyllis Schlafly Center in St. Louis, Clayton, Missouri, and we're going to start now because besides having folks here, and there'll be some more on the way, we're broadcasting this live on Facebook Live at Eagle Forum Education Center, and that's our St. Louis building here. At this building, you can see behind us, we have some of our archives in this side of the building. And this is the office in Clayton where Phyllis worked. Phyllis Schlafly worked for about the last 25 years of her career. Before that, she was in Alton. And so we welcome you here. Today, I'm very honored to welcome Babette Francis. Babette is a longtime friend of Phyllis Schlafly. We spent the better part of, an hour or so today recording a history for our archives of Babette's meeting with Phyllis in the early 1980s, the first encounter. Interesting detail, it was in the airport in Chicago as Babette was coming back from, I think, Europe, going to Australia. And Phyllis was up in Chicago, and they met for the first time, and they struck up a friendship. And over the years, they've been together many times in Australia, where Babette has lived for many, many years, originally from India, and then married and moved to Melbourne, Australia. But in Australia, Babette started a program, an organization called Endeavour Forum. Originally had a different name, but actually I didn't get it right. Women Who Want to Be Women. Started in the mid-1970s, focused on the question of feminism that was sweeping across America and Australia, and then ultimately the organization Endeavour Forum embraced the important role in Australia of being for the family and for traditional marriage, and especially pro-life. And all the issues. They publish a quarterly newsletter, have done that since the early 1980s. Something about these women leaders that publish these newsletters that are so great. We get Endeavour Forum ourselves. In fact, is it endeavourforum.org? Is that the website?
Yes, .au.
Endeavourforum.au. We'll post that on our website. But in the last few years, as we've talked to Babette, she's been interested in the UN issues, where she's monitored the UN for many years. But today we're going to spend some time with her. She wanted to speak to the American audience, and that's why we're putting it on Facebook Live, about the issue of Islam, and in particular her perspective of Donald Trump, President Trump, speaking about Islam and his policies. And the background of that is Babette was born in India, raised in India. At the age of 23, met and fell in love and married an Australian lawyer and moved to Melbourne. But she has a perspective as a native Indian and the history of India, of course, having lived through that period, and also having just been in education on policy and these issues. And so it's an important issue. We have a handout here in person. If you're on Facebook Live, we'll post the handout later, or we'll get a scan online, and we're going to have a discussion for a while. Babette's going to speak, and then we will have some questions and answers. And if you were here in the Phyllis Schlafly Center, you could have cookies and coffee and things, but you'll just have to imagine that on Facebook. So without further ado, I want to introduce our great friend, Babette Francis. Babette?
Thank you very much, Ed.
Over there.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here, and it's a great grief to me that Phyllis is not with us. I feel her spirit is here still with us. She was a great friend and colleague and collaborator with me on a number of issues. I wanted to talk to you about Islam because the Eagle Forum has a great, wonderful history of fighting communism and Marxism, and Phyllis took that up during her political work. But the enemy now is a political Islam. I think communism has been more or less neutralized, even the Chinese pay lip service to it, but it's not a major issue at the moment. But Islam is a critical issue for our time. I read a heading in the Australian newspaper, that's our major national newspaper, a few days ago, saying that by the year 2070, Islam was going to be the major religion in the world. It would have overtaken Christianity. And this alarmed me. I'm a Christian myself, because although I won't be around in 2017, barring some kind of miracle, but my youngest child might be, and shudder to think of the kind of world that she might inhabit at that time. It's important at this stage to draw a distinction between Islam and Muslims, just like there is a distinction between Nazism and Germans. Not every German was a Nazi. In fact, I always say when I speak about Islam that Muslims are the main victims of Islam. Islam needs to be reformed, Muslims need to be liberated from it. To give you a bit of my background, I was born in India and I lived through Indian independence, which was in 1947, when we got independence as a colony of Britain. And it was a happy time, a time of celebration, but it was also marred by the fact that the subcontinent of India, which is as big as Europe, excluding Russia, India looks small on the map, but it's really a big country. It's big as Europe, excluding Russia. And it's got far more variety of languages and cultures and religions than Europe has. It's a very multicultural, if you like, country. Well, the tragedy about independence was that India was split up into India and Pakistan. It's called partition. And that was a great tragedy for us. But the ongoing tragedy at that time also was that there was a lot of rioting and killing between Hindus and Muslims. The Christians were more or less saved from all that, but the Hindus and Muslims were fighting each other, and somewhere between 1 million and 3 million people were killed in that, mutual fighting on both sides. I was at university at that time, so coupled with our rejoicing about Indian independence was this horror at the rioting and the killing between Hindus and Muslims. Now, the significant thing about the reason India was divided into India and Pakistan, because the Muslims, their leader Muhammad Ali Jinnah, couldn't tolerate the idea of Muslims living in a secular democracy, which is what India was going to be. And so they decided that the majority Muslim state would separate from India and form Pakistan. That was the start of Pakistan. Now, the sad thing was that you can't escape from Islam. When the country was divided, a lot of the Hindus from what were the Muslim provinces that were going to become Pakistan fled to India, and equally Muslims from India opted to go to Pakistan. These were mainly poor people, peasants, who may have had a small plot of land or something. So there was a lot of movement back and forth. Muslims going to Pakistan and Hindus coming back to India. The tragedy was that Pakistanis didn't want to, you can't escape from Islam. One of the things, the brutal things they did was, in India people often travel on the top of trains. When the trains are packed, they'll travel on the top. You may have seen pictures of this, and it's sort of funny in a way when it's happening in peaceful times. But what the Muslims in Pakistan, many of them did, was they would string wires across the telegraph poles on either side of the railway lines. There were telegraph poles along our railway lines, and they'd string a wire across that, so the people traveling on the tops of the trains would be swept to their death. And I wrote a story once about a girl I met in one of who escaped from Pakistan into India. She was a Hindu. And she said how terrified she and her family were about traveling, because they weren't certain they'd find room in the body of the train. They might have to travel on the top, and she was worried about these wires that would periodically strung across. And her boyfriend was a Muslim. It was, they'd fallen in love, but they decided it just wouldn't work because his family wouldn't accept her. She had no money. She was Hindu, and it was just going to be a disaster. So she was escaping from their tiny plot of land in Pakistan to India. She was very worried about, whether they'd survive the journey. And he said to her, "Don't worry. Let me know when you're going, and I will cut the wires if there is one across the thing." And she said, "How will I know that it's safe?" And he said, "I'll get up on that bridge there and I'll shine a light to let you know that it's okay." And I wrote a story about this, quite a moving story, and he did. The day that she traveled, he was on the bridge and he flashed a light, so she knew it was okay, that there wouldn't be a wire across the thing. And they got there safely. And I met her when she was a refugee. She actually got typhoid, was very ill in India, but she survived eventually. But it's quite a love story.
Yeah.
He did this for her. But this gives you an example of how you can't escape from Islam. In Islam, it calls for the killing of infidels. That's anyone who's not a Jew or a Christian. anyone else who's an atheist or Hindu or whatever is called an infidel, and he calls for the killing of infidels, the killing of apostates. That's anyone who tries to leave Islam. If you say, I don't believe in this anymore, and you decide to leave, well, you're under sentence of death. And homosexuals, that's the other target, all under death sentence. The other, Christians and Jews are allowed to live, but under 3 conditions. They can either convert to Islam, or they pay a special tax, or they under sentence of death. So they have a sort of diminished status, but they're regarded as people of the book. That's people of the Bible, the Abraham's 3 monotheistic religions. Now, I personally don't go along with this. I feel like throwing up when I hear some of our clerics talking about the 3 monotheistic faiths and Abraham's 3 religions. Abraham would be turning in his grave or wherever he is if he regarded Islam as part of this trilogy, because certainly Judaism and Christians are derived from the Bible and from the word of the Lord. But I believe that Islam has come out from Satan, quite frankly. It's a monotheistic religion, but that's its only claim to justification. But apart from that, it's not a respectable religion at all. And as I've said, Muslims are the main victims of Islam. Look who's being killed at the moment. From shortly after the time of Muhammad, Islam divided into 2 sects, Sunni and Shia. There were minor sects, but these are the main ones. Sunni and Shia. The main representatives at the present time, the Sunnis are Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf states, and Shia as Iran. So they're 2 factions, and they've been at war since shortly after the death of Muhammad. This war has been in either a cold phase or a hot phase. It's in a particularly hot phase at the moment. So who are they killing? The majority of the people there that are being killed are Muslims, men, women, and children. They're being killed by Sunni and Shia, by the Taliban, by Al-Qaeda, you name it. So when people try to accuse me of being anti-Islam, I say to them, look at who they're killing. They're killing each other. They need to be liberated and freed. Muslims are the main victims of Islam. Now, Islam doesn't mean peace, despite the constant mouthing of our clerics, and even George Bush, after 9/11, he came out saying that George W. Bush, he said, Islam's a religion of peace. Islam doesn't mean peace, it means submission to the will of Allah, and it's interpreted by his prophet Muhammad. And Islam has never been peaceful. Muhammad had a short period of his life when he was in Mecca, when he was relatively powerless, when it was peaceful. But as soon as he acquired tribal and military power, it became a very violent religion, and he converted by the sword. This war between the Sunni and Shia has been going on for the past 14th century. So it's just nonsense when people describe Islam as a religion of peace. The Quran, the holy book of Islam, as I said, mandates the killing of infidels, apostates, and homosexuals. I won't go over that again, but there are copies of this there, and the relevant verses are mentioned in that. The politicians of our major parties in Australia, as well as in the United States, pay lip service to this idea that Islam's a religion of peace and that we've got to tolerate it like all other religions. But I regard it as a totalitarian political ideology which is akin to communism, and it covers all aspects of life. Communism didn't dictate how you wash yourself, but Islam does. It really dominates every aspect of your life. And it's really not only a religion, but a totalitarian political ideology, and it has to be treated on that basis. And that's why I respect your President Donald Trump, because in a sort of relatively unsophisticated way, he's seen that there is something there that needs to be challenged, that needs to be reformed. And I applaud him for that. He said, even when he was running in the primaries, that we should stop immigration until we know what on earth is going on, And I think that's, I don't know whether you have inquiries that's commissioned. You have them on a major topic. We have what we call a Royal Commission in Australia, where there's a particular big issue, maybe a disaster where a dam collapses and hundreds of people are killed, or some big corruption or something, and you have a Royal Commission into it. And some of our less sophisticated the minor parties have suggested we need to have a royal commission into Islam and find out, as Donald Trump said, just what on earth do they believe. But people have no understanding of the finer points of Islam, just what it represents. The Sharia law is the other aspect of Islam is that it's grossly discriminatory to women, and that's where Endeavour Forum comes in, because we genuinely believe in the rights of women. People say you're against women because we're pro-life and pro-family, but we say it's not being against women just to help her to have her baby and not to kill her child because of poverty, kill the baby in the uterus because of poverty or some other problem. So we're genuinely pro-women, and it absolutely stuns me, this unholy alliance between the left and Islam. You know, where does this come from? It's unbelievable, because Islam is so rigidly conservative on issues like homosexuality, and the left is very pro-homosexual. So how they form this unholy alliance is beyond me.
The devil. The devil. That's a common factor.
I think that the mutual thing is that the left and Islam both hate America, so that's their common.
Yeah.
Your enemy's enemy is my friend, and that's how they unite over there. One of the alarming things that's happening is that Islam seems to go through a phase where it's fairly moderate, and then a phase where it's very active and very militant. We're going through a very militant phase. The tragedy that's happening in Turkey, for example, under Kemal Ataturk in the 1920s, he made Turkey a very secular country. It was a sort of a military coup, but they kept it secular, and Turkey made great economic progress. Because one of the things that's happened under Islam is that you're kept poor and uneducated, and you really, despite a lot of oil wealth, the masses of people don't profit from it, don't benefit. The education is poor. They just focus on the Quran, not on scientific education, and it just doesn't make economic progress. Well, what's happening in Turkey is that the present president is a militant Islamist, and he's imprisoned or sacked the generals, and he's trying to make Turkey as Islamic as possible. And he's lobbying in Europe that the Turks who are in various countries in Europe should support him. This is why there's problems in the Netherlands and also in, I think, Germany. They've excluded the Turkish representatives now and then lobbying among their people because they think Turkey is not being helpful. It's a country really to watch. It's going the wrong way. We're worried about Indonesia, which is quite close to Australia. It's the biggest Muslim country, and it's on our northern border. And Indonesia has a secular, democratic constitution. But recently, when the mayor of Jakarta, who's Chinese Christian, he was running for a political office, and he was accused of blasphemy. This is another big ploy used by Muslims to persecute somebody, maybe their next door neighbor. They might be having a dispute about the fence or about, my chicken flew over your fence and, I need to get the eggs or something. They accuse the neighbor of blasphemy. And this is Christians as well as Muslims, they accuse them of blasphemy, and that's punishable by death. So immediately the person is arrested, put into prison, and has a trial. Anyway, the mayor of Jakarta, who's a Chinese Christian, did a very good job and was going to win the election, whatever he was standing for. He's accused of blasphemy, and that trial is ongoing. The president of Pakistan has stood by him, came to Australia and has stood by him, but there are riots of up to 100,000 people in the streets of Indonesia opposing this Chinese mayor. His name is Ahok, a short form of his long Christian name. So that's going on in Indonesia. Malaysia is also tending to become more Islamic, a little bit more fundamentalist. One of the tragedies of Islam is that the marriage age for girls can't be raised to a respectable 16 or 18, because the Prophet Muhammad married Aisha when she was 6 and consummated the marriage when she was 9. So, this is pedophilia by any standard. So, because of his example, Iran is lowering the marriage age for girls from 10 to 9 against the wishes of the women's groups. And Malaysia can't raise the marriage age from whatever it is to 16 or 18 because of the example of the Prophet. So it's having an impact right now. Aisha was just one of Muhammad's various wives and concubines and so on. Slave taking is another aspect of warfare that is sanctioned by Islam. There's some saying in the Quran that what your right hand possesses you can take unto yourself or something. So you capture women in a war, you defeat a tribe, you can take their women, you kill the men and you take the women and children as sex slaves and the young boys as future warriors, so that's another aspect of it. But our organization is concerned with the shocking discrimination against women. Islam allows up to 4 wives, 4 legal wives and any number of concubines. And you can also have temporary marriages for the purpose of prostitution. If you want to engage the services of a prostitute, you have a temporary marriage with her, and then you divorce her after the relationship, and what you pay her for her services is the alimony. So it's made all very respectable. Prostitution is a temporary marriage. Women are regarded as sort of half the worth of men in the court of law under Islam. The other horrendous thing is that if a woman is raped in Islamic countries, she has to produce 4 pious male witnesses to prove that it was rape and not consensual. Otherwise, she's accused of adultery or fornication, and she can be stoned to death, for being raped. So these are some of the aspects that we're very concerned about. We're a women's organization. We truly believe in the equality and dignity of women, and we think this is absolutely horrendous. And we're just amazed at the feminists forming an alliance with Islam. This mind-boggling. This recent march, you had women's march, you had a Muslim woman there joining with the rabid feminists. It was incomprehensible to me. Absolutely. The other thing I wanted to say was, so we're concerned about this terrible treatment under Sharia law. We think it's quite inconsistent with democracy. I have a sort of constructive solution to this to offer. It's not all just negative. People say that the vast majority of Muslims are moderate and they're not a threat. I agree with that. The vast majority are moderate and they don't like violence. But they're also fairly helpless. They can't do anything against the imams and the sheikhs. And a lot of the women are uneducated. In some of the Asian countries and African countries, they don't even know how to read. They're probably not even aware of the more horrendous aspects of the Quran. So the moderates are no great help to us. The ones who could be a help to us are what I call the activists, who see the necessity for reforming Islam. And there are a handful of them, very brave people. We've got a few of them in Australia, and we've got a few of them in the United States. These are the people who can be a real help to us in moving for a reform of Islam. It needs a tremendous reform, far more than the Catholic Church needed at the time of the Reformation. It needs a whole scrub. I don't quite know what will be left after you scrub the example of the life of the Prophet and the horrendous reads of the Quran, but there's some good aspects of it when you talk about almsgiving and fasting and prayers, and that's all fine. So it's these activists within Islam who are calling for reform, who I think could be of real value to us. And to me, the far exemplar of this is the President of Egypt, General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. And I would encourage your President to invite him here on a goodwill tour. He's had Benjamin Netanyahu from Israel. He should now invite the President of Egypt, because he's described as a devout Muslim, but he's called for a reform of Islam, and he says, how can we be mired in an 800-year-old theocracy, which was a very courageous thing for him to say. He's probably under sentence of death, and the Muslim Brotherhood are probably trying to shoot him as soon as they can. But he's someone that I think your President should invite on a state visit, because his opponents are the Muslim Brotherhood, who are represented in the United States by CARE, the Council of American Islamic Relations, and I think they're a real menace in your country. They're a real physical within your country. So I think it would be great if President Trump invited the President here on a goodwill tour, and between the two of them, they can decide how to reform Islam, and we'll all get a wonderful positive result. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer questions.
Let me start with this one. One of the questions that is roiling America now is the so-called Muslim ban. You know, the president has said certain countries from which we know people that have been coming to cause harm, we're going to stop allowing immigration or refugees or anything. What's your opinion of that, and how does the world, we hear from the media that the world finds all of this so offensive, but how is Australia, what's Australia's policies like? And
well, I'll answer by posing a problem to you. How would you deal with it? The problem is this: the refugees who come genuinely have suffered and are probably moderate and non-violent. They come and they work hard, they establish a little business and they prosper and they keep their heads down and they turn out to be good citizens. The trouble is their children have a big risk of becoming radicalized because Islam doesn't allow you to integrate into the wider society. Their children don't have the opportunity of meeting members of the opposite sex or going out on dates or playing tennis with a girl of their own age, just ordinary social activity. The children go to the local mosque where they're radicalized by the latest imam from Saudi Arabia or Iran, and they see their identity, their pride in identifying with ISIS or Al-Qaeda or some radical thing. So it's the children who can be the potential danger. How do you solve this problem? Because you don't know which children,
Right.
So it's sort of like importing something that can be a threat in the future. And you tell me, how do you deal with this?
Well, how does Australia deal with it?
Australia has controlled illegal immigration. That's one way you can deal with it, by controlling illegal immigration. I don't think Muslim illegal immigration is a problem for you. You've got Mexican illegal immigration. But you certainly control illegal immigration. And I would give priority in immigration to the victims of the war in the Middle East, who are the Christians and the Yazidis and other minorities. Even some Muslim sects, for example, there are Muslim Ahmadiyas, for example, some of those, they're genuinely non-violent. And I would give priority to those to show you're not sort of anti-Muslim. But if I was the president and I had power, I would be very wary of accepting large numbers of Muslim immigrants because you don't know what's going to happen in the next generation. That's the problem.
Questions? Comments? Yeah.
Why,
Nice and loud.
why is it spreading so much? Why is Islam soon, you said in 2070, it would overtake Christians? What's your opinion on that? Why? Why is there this pull to join such?
I think partly because Christians have lost their internal spirit of evangelization. That's one thing. Our Pope, unfortunately, the Catholic Pope has said he's against proselytization. I'm not quite sure what he means by that, but I would use the word evangelization. We're not as missionary-minded as we once were. That's one thing. The other thing that's had a big effect is the contraceptive pill. Christians are having small families. Muslims with their 4 wives are quite simply outbreeding us. It's as simple as that. They have 4 wives and each wife has 6 or 7 children. The wives are kept pretty well submissive and locked up in the home. Their role is seen as homemaker and bearer of children. They're simply outbreeding us. That's one of the main reasons.
Yes.
I wanted to answer his question too. We have this gay agenda, and then you have kids that are Christians, like my 2 oldest kids, that are postponing marriage. They want to do the right thing. They actually wait till they get married to have sex and to have children. So the ones that are considered conservative, radical Christians are doing the right thing. They're going on in college. They're postponing dating and the moral stuff. The radical Christians that are against homosexuality is going to stop you from having offspring. Not getting married or postponing marriage is going to keep you from having offspring.
So the Christians are getting, Christians are not just the ones who are secular citizens of America and Australia. The average marriage age is around about 28 or something. It may even be 29 or 30. And so they're having 2 or 3 children. The birth rate in Australia is 1.9, I think, and I think you dropped below replacement level as well. Whereas the Muslims, the girls are getting married from anything from 10 years upwards. They're having about half a dozen children by the time they're 19.
Yeah, as opposed to going to college and doing the right thing and having the marriage before the kid, like people do.
I wanted to ask you something you said earlier today about the UN. You were talking about President Trump and his budget to cut certain things, and you described the sort of ongoing creation of dependency on the UN. So,
one of the biggest voting blocs at the UN is what do they call themselves? The Council for Islamic Relations, some name like that. And it consists of a block of 58 Muslim countries. They want to impose a blasphemy law through the UN on all the world, not just in their own countries, but all over. That's one of the things that they're doing. And this bloc is also very anti-Israel. And that's one of the difficult issues the president has to tackle, because he should not only cut funding to the UN, but specifically he should cut funding to it's called UNWRA, the UN Fund for the World Refugee Assistance, UNRWA, which has funded the Palestinian so-called refugees for generations. And it's created a really nasty, cancerous sore in the Middle East, where these people are refugees for generations. You know, in most wars throughout history, there were refugees after every war, but when the war was over, the conflict was over, these refugees either stayed in the country where they'd taken refuge, or they went back to their own country if it was possible. You know, like in India, we have wars on our borders and people flood into India, but when the war's finished, they either stay in India or they go back to their country. But in Palestine, these refugees are a permanent sort of refugee population. You know, they're staying there permanently in the sort of mythical hope that they'll be able to go back to Israel. For several generations, you know, there may have been maybe 1 million refugees when Israel was established, but now they're on into the hundreds of millions because they stayed there for 6 generations. And how can Israel absorb them? So the UN, mainly the United States, the major funder, funds these refugees to remain as permanent refugees for generation after generation. And I think that should be cut straight away. And I'd also cut funding to the UN because it keeps on demonizing Israel. Maybe Israel has committed some faults in building some settlements which maybe they were not entitled to do. I don't know the ins and outs of it. They say no, that they built on something that were going to be land swaps when the two states were established. But the UN constantly, passes resolutions criticizing Israel out of all proportion to all the other horrendous things that are going on. You know, there are wars absolutely brutal wars going on in Africa. There are things that China's doing. There's wars in the Middle East. Pakistan's behavior has been terrible in regard to Christians and also to Muslim minorities. But the UN is always passing resolutions against Israel. So I think President Trump should threaten the UN that he'll cut funding to them if they don't develop some sense of proportion.
Oh, I wanted to ask you, I understand you're going to be addressing the UN.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Are you going to be addressing the UN? Is that correct?
she said, are you going to be addressing the UN?
We are not allowed to address the UN because we are non-government organizations. I'm not on the official Australian delegation. I wish I was.
But you're going to
Let me clarify. Endeavour Forum has for almost 20 years had status at the UN as an NGO, non-governmental organization.
So we can't address the UN, but we are entitled to run what they call parallel events, that's NGO events, which are run outside the UN, in a building called the Church Center, which is outside the UN, just across the road from the UN. And if we apply for this parallel event every year, and if you're lucky, you get one. We've got one this year. You've got to phrase your
topic,
title of your workshop in a parallel event very tactfully. You know, if you say, this is a pro-life workshop telling women about the problems that will happen as a result of an abortion, you've got no chance at all. But we've called our workshop the reproductive health of Asian women. And we're
sounds wonderfully
designed.
But real quick, just to let you know, and listeners, our executive director, Rebecca Gander, who's in DC now, she'll be attending. they're
So you're
doing
gonna
it. It's
meet
later this
up?
week. Yeah, later this
So
week.
we're
I have to
running
ask
this
you-
panel event in the building across from the UN, and we'll be talking about the bad effects of abortion on Asian women. We are relating it to Asian women because they had a very low incidence of breast cancer until recently. But with all that the West has brought in with population control, abortion, and the pill, the incidence of breast cancer is rising. So that's what our work.
And now, wait, where is that it's rising?
In New York.
In Asia.
Oh, sorry, in Asia, yes. The
In Asia.
breast,
Yes,
breast cancer
I
rates.
keep telling this to my sister and she won't believe me and it gets me so darn mad.
No,
But anyway,
there are a
I wanna
lot of
ask-
studies recently showing the rising incidence of breast
Yeah,
cancer.
I know, even the CDC says it, but I want to ask you, these women here that we see in St. Louis, and it gets very, very beastly hot here. Well, today's an example, and it's the first day of spring. I don't understand how they can survive wearing all those clothes. Wouldn't you think they would just say that the heck with it? They're afraid to.
I think she's referring to the Muslim women wearing the heavy outfits.
When it's
yeah.
hot,
When it's hot.
how do they stand it?
I don't know.
I think that's just plain cruelty, It's absolutely,
I think it's
yeah.
abuse of women.
I don't know. We've seen some nuns in your day that would wear that
Listen,
too.
my
And, that's-
granddaughter that's 12 years old, a couple of years ago, we were looking at my yearbooks from high school and college, and she said, Grandma, they must be awful hot in the summer. And I said, yeah, I think that was kind of dumb too. Well, I do.
That's progress. I guess that's progress.
Getting back to this Asian women basically don't have most of the risk factors for breast cancer. They get married early, they have several children, they breastfeed, they're not overweight, they don't drink alcohol. So they don't have most of the risk factors for breast cancer. But the incidence has suddenly risen because of abortion, because of the pill, and so on.
And what would be your time frame for that, when this started happening? The last 10, 15 years?
Something like that, with during the Clinton administration, there was a lot of funding for population
Oh,
control.
really?
America is the major funder of population control.
Of everything bad. Most of the things bad.
And at the moment, homosexuality don't seem to be.
We're on the cutting edge. We're on the cutting
You
edge.
fly the homosexual flag alongside the stars and stripes.
So do you think the UN do you have any hope that it's reforming now because of Trump?
Well, it will have to. If he's got any sense, he'll use the power of the purse to get reform. And I think the new president of the UN is a little bit better than Ban Ki-moon. I think he's from somewhere in Latin America. Anthony Guterres, of name is. It's just recently.
Not Portugal? No,
Portugal could be, yes.
Portugal, maybe.
Yeah. So I think he's marginally better. So hopefully it will, the UN might be a little bit better. But the United States, the power of the purse is in your hands. You're the major funder of the UN. If Trump says we cut funds unless you, reform yourselves. And you've got a good ambassador to the UN, and Nikki Haley. She comes from India.
There you go. That's right. No wonder. Other questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned an organization earlier, the Muslim Brotherhood, which for me has been a concern here in St. Louis for some time because they've become very active here in the city of St. Louis. Your opinion, currently there's a call to actually have the Muslim Brotherhood listed as a terrorist organization, very similar to what Sinn Féin was, I guess, during the 70s, with the IRA conflict. What are your thoughts? I mean, what part is the Muslim Brotherhood actually playing in furthering this international jihad that's being called for?
Well, it's certainly doing it in America through CARE, I think, and the Muslim Brotherhood has been declared a terrorist organization in some of the Muslim countries in the Middle East. So I think the first thing to do is to maybe declare CARE non persona grata. I don't quite know how you do it without calling it terrorist because they haven't actually indulged in violence themselves. But it's certainly not a respectable organization, I'll put it that way. I also want to tell you about the terrible things that are going on in Pakistan, this blasphemy law, how badly it works. Everyone's focused on the plight of Christians and minorities in the Middle East, but the plight of Christians in Pakistan, which I identify with because they're my people, it's just terrible. Your neighbor accuses you of blasphemy, you're thrown into jail. Isia Bibi has been in jail, a mother of 5 children, I think. She's been in jail for the last 5 years under death sentence on some spurious charge of blasphemy. You know, she drank some water from a well, which was her Muslim neighbor objected, and Isia Bibi spoke to her about Jesus Christ and said he's done so much for the world, and she was promptly accused of blasphemy, thrown into jail, and her trial has been postponed for, you know, for years. The Pakistani government is in a dilemma. If they convict her and hang her, there'll be an outcry against worldwide condemnation. If they release her, there'll be riots in the streets of Pakistan, and they will be, you know, under the gun. So, in fact, Spain has offered to take Isia Bibi as a refugee, accepted it. So the Pakistani government's got to find some way of letting her. She's the co-celebrate example of Christians. But they're not only Christians who are in prison in Pakistan for blasphemy, they're Muslims as well. So it shows how insane the whole situation is.
Other questions? Yes.
When a Christian, though, gets put in the Middle East for jail due to blasphemy laws, it does draw a lot more national attention, doesn't it? When it's a Christian that's a victim for the blasphemy law, correct?
That's right, yes.
Because I signed so many petitions for the ACBB on Facebook for her to get released.
Please do sign the petitions.
I've signed so many. I always share them right and left. I mean,
that's all we can do. I feel, in a way, sorry for the Pakistani government. You know, they can't release her. Recently, one of the judges who was supposed to sit on her trial was fixed for a certain date. He recused himself. You know, the judges are in a dilemma. If they acquit her, they'll be assassinated. You know, the Muslim governor of Punjab in Pakistan, he spoke out against the blasphemy laws. This is the Muslim governor. He was assassinated by his own driver. This is the insanity of Islam.
Now, one last question. I'll pose it because earlier today we had a long discussion on this, although it was a shorter discussion because how you finished it. We were talking about judges. And in America, the judges that decide, a Hawaiian judge, as you said, and you spoke of the perspective in Australia of the Australian people of American and their judges. I don't maybe make a comment. And we of course went back to Phyllis Schlafly's book, The Supremacists, which we were talking about. You might make your comment was pretty fitting.
I've forgotten what I said.
Well, I mean,
I couldn't understand why a judge in Hawaii can overrule your president on foreign policy, because our parliament, our prime minister, has the power to set the policy on foreign policy. It's not for the judges. I don't understand.
We don't either.
Yeah, we don't.
Why doesn't Trump arrest those judges?
We are
if
equally
he's
clueless as to why this is going on.
Yeah,
I'm quite bewildered by this. But anyway, my message to Trump is invite General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi to America. He's invited Benjamin Netanyahu, so he now should invite the President of Egypt.
Nope.
And by the way, the two of them are working together for peace in the Middle East. You know, not so much openly, but they cooperate on the problems in the Sinai and so on. So Egypt and Israel have a good working relationship, and I think that would be a great thing for Trump to do, to show that he's not anti-Muslim. Neither am I. As I said, Muslims are the main victims of Islam. We need to liberate them and the Christian ideal evangelize them.
Great. Well,
I want to say something to everybody here. You didn't live in St. Louis at the time. It was during the Iranian crisis. I'm sure John would.
I was around, yes.
Yeah.
Under Gaddafi,
okay.
yes.
We accidentally were visiting my cousin that's in a retirement center, and Rocky Sickman spoke to everybody there. And he was a hostage for, what was it, how many days?
444.
444, I think.
Yep.
And he said, when he was a hostage, he said the 10-year-olds were yelling, "Death to America." And he said those 10-year-olds now are in their 40s or whatever, and he said they feel the very same way that they did back then when I was a hostage.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that.
Right. Well, let me just thank Babette. We've got, if you want to stay after, we've got time. I want to shut off Facebook Live, but Babette will be here. Thank you, Babette, for coming second year in a row, all that you do. And for those of you that are listening that are in New York, the NGO, we could get to go to pseagles.com, find out more, or right here on the Facebook page. And we appreciate you being here.
It's at 4:30 p.m. in the Church Center, the 10th floor, on the
In New York
23rd
City.
of March.
Yeah, on the 23rd of March. So, okay, thank you, we'll kill that, and if you want